This episode of the Better Every Shift podcast is sponsored by MSA, the world's leading manufacturer of high-quality fire rescue and safety solutions, protecting first responders around the world since 1914. For more information, visit msafire.com.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Better Every Shift podcast. My name is Aaron Zamzow. I'll be your host through this journey that we will be breaking down today. It is a journey, all right, because today we're going to be talking about PPE. We have a wonderful guest that's going to really dumb it down for us, or as I told him, speak in a language a truck guy can understand. But I'm not alone on this journey. Obviously, the commander, thank God she's back and with me to help keep me on track. Janelle Fosquet, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
We're good. This topic that we're talking about today is one that can be confusing. And just speaking with our guest, Jeff Stull, who is a PPE expert, he can say it a lot better than I can. And he has actually taught me more in the last 15 minutes than I've probably learned in the last 4 years trying to read through some of the NFPA changes and such. So we're going to address those today. Jeff, first of all, thank you for being on the program. Happy to have you here.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
And you've been a busy man. You've been breaking down some of the possible NFPA changes. You've been in meetings. You've been on webinars. As I mentioned before, you are a PPE expert. You're the president of the International Personnel Protection Incorporated, member of several NFPA committees on PPE, as well as the ASTM International Committee on Protective Clothing. You've authored a book, PPE Made Easy, which I love the title, and that's kind of how we'll treat the show today. You've been featured speaker on multiple PPE-focused webinars in recent years as NFPA changes have been, on the horizon for the last couple of years. You just did a webinar with us here at Lexipol. My first question is, how did you start getting involved with PPE and being the expert? How does one do that?
Well, it was really by accident. I was in the Coast Guard as an officer, and I just came back from being assigned to a ship doing drug interdiction of all things off Florida coast. And I got assigned to the Coast Guard's Office of Research and Development. They had a program where the guy was just leaving the need to fill on shipboard firefighting and hazmat, maritime incident control, and they had a program to put together PPE specific for their needs. But at the time, there wasn't much in the way of hazmat, in that being back in the early 80s. And so I ended up working with the IFF. They said, well, we need to develop hazmat for our members too. And so it just became a natural step into building standards, to build the equipment that everyone needed to protect themselves, and extended to EMS and structural and wildland and everything else. So anything PPE, whether it's a respirator, clothing, gloves, boots, all those things I became interested in and worked on.
So you've been doing this for over 40 years then?
That's correct. Actually, it's about that. Yeah, 40 years now, more than 40 years now.
So were you around the rubber boots? Were those first in when you got started?
Yeah, rubber boots. I mean, I saw the transition where everything was rubber, and then, eventually leather now is dominant, as you know, and lots of other changes, honestly. We're actually just going to bunker coats and pants. I mean, that transition was happening when I got involved. So I've seen a lot of change,
including the SCBAs, right?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, that time they fortunately were moving towards the pressure demand open circuit SCBA. Before it was just a demand, so you could have air leakage, and even little things like cleaning clothing was. I used to say it's the Marlboro man, because there was the image of the gritty firefighter. I'm an experienced firefighter because I'm dirty, and obviously my clothing shows that I hardworking firefighter at fires, which obviously is not the right message nowadays.
Yeah. So everything from the old time, I shouldn't say old time, but the mid 80s to today, you've seen this tremendous amount of change. And it seems like the last couple of years in PPE, we're seeing just as much change. The hardest part for someone like myself, like just, an officer in the field, with all the different changes coming up, I mean, what would you say? Where can we begin? What do you think someone like myself needs to know about these current and like the changes that are coming up?
Well, I think the thing is, it takes multiple groups. There's not one forum that's going to give you all the answers, right? So the NFPA standard, if you try to read that and learn what's going on from that, I'm going to have to say you're going to fail, because it just isn't written for that purpose. It's written for a manufacturer to build their equipment, to get it tested, certified, and that's that. Now, there's other sources of information. I mean, NFPA could do a better job at some of that, but there are other organizations. The manufacturers are well briefed often and being able to uh, give you the synopsis of what's important for you. And then there's other user groups that come out, whether it's the IFF, the IFC, NBC, and those organizations will also be somewhat instructive of what to expect and what's going on. But it is getting more difficult because there's, the fire service is being tasked more and more, and there's new hazards being, identified, whether it's lithium-ion battery fires now or some other thing that becomes a new issue that the fire service has to deal with.
So when changes come up, you just had a big meeting on this past Thursday, I think on June 20th. So changes are, and I won't do this justice, so I'll transfer this question onto you. Janelle's already smiling a little bit. So what's the process of these changes? Where are we at currently with the process?
Well, so any standard that we write, and so let's first of all talk about a standard with the values. Standard basically isn't a blueprint. It doesn't say make it this way. What it says is make it so it does this. We like to say our standards are performance specifications, meaning that you don't tell someone how to build it, you tell them what it has to do. And
Okay.
so that's these big books now that are getting thicker and thicker because we keep identifying new requirements. But those requirements are put into a system of standard, which includes design aspects, performance, test methods, certification, labeling, user information. All that stuff goes into the standard. And we make changes. We make changes in response to new hazards. We make changes with technology improving. We make changes to address things that we may not have considered important before that now are important. And they revise these standards every 5 years. And the NFPA has a fairly decent process for how they do that. First of all, they try to revise their standards every 5 years because they say, a lot can happen in 5 years. We didn't worry as much about lithium-ion battery fires 5 years ago. Now we are. And likewise, we have other things we find out, heat stresses, was a big deal, about 20 years ago that we're now addressing much more aptly. So we make these changes to address that. And the process they have really is and this is what the fire service really needs to take home. You are empowered to make some of these changes. You can write to the NFPA. The process is a little quirky, but you can say, hey, I think this needs to be changed, or I think you need to address this. And you can do it as broadly or as specific as you'd like. But the fact is, there's this public input phase. The committee takes those public inputs. They do the stuff that they want to do. They come up with a first draft. And then it goes through again. And then it goes through a public comment stage where, again, I don't like the way you did this, so let's change this. Or we learned something different. We need to address that. So then the committee goes through those, and they make their own changes again. And then they come up with a second draft. So this is all a prelude to what just happened last week. So the committee comes up, they vote in, they all get a consensus. That means the majority, 2/3 of the committee says this is the way it should be. But that doesn't mean everyone's satisfied. So at last week's technical meeting that the NFPA holds, they say anyone who wants to say, we don't like what happened, we want to reverse that decision, they can petition and make a motion at this annual meeting, and they get to walk up to the microphone, explain their case, and then the membership votes on it. The only thing that's really different there is instead of a committee making those decisions, it's the entire association. So this is anyone that may not even be interested in PPE. They may be interested in electrical code or sprinkler systems and all the other stuff that NFPA does. But they hear the arguments and then they vote one way or the other, and the motions either go forward or they don't. And that's how you end up with a standard. They take all this information, it goes before a group called the Standards Council, and ultimately they decide whether the standard gets issued or not. They look at all the arguments, pending amendments, appeals, all this other stuff. They sort all that out and then issue the standard.
Was the meeting last week specific to NFPA 1970 and the consolidation, or was it a broader group?
Well, it's a much broader group. So this is
Okay.
any standard that's in its revision cycle. So there are standards on entirely different matters, on hazardous materials, on other issues that had nothing to do with personal protective equipment. So 1970 was in this year's slot for that type of review and at the technical meeting. And that's the other thing that's happened that's made things a little bit more complicated. I don't, there's different opinions on this, but what NFPA has done is they've taken standards that they think are similar and put them together. So there used to be a separate standard on turnout gear, and then there was one on work uniforms, and then there was one on self-contained breathing apparatus and PASS devices. They decided to put all four of those items together in one standard, believing that there would be some synergism or some things, they work together as a system, and that eventually that would facilitate an improvement of this system approach. And that hasn't happened yet, but we still have all the headaches of consolidation. And that was a chore to put those standards together and like definitions and make sure things are homogenous and all the other stuff.
Yeah, and that's 1970.
That's
So all
1970.
those together.
The new number is 1970. It used to be
Yeah.
71 turnout gear, 81 for SCBA and others having different designations as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
75, 82 for PASS
Yes.
devices. All that'll fall under 1970 as if everything continues to progress. Correct.
Right. And it should progress the way it is. It's just now it's a little more complicated. It's a bigger book. And it's obviously harder to sift through, and there's more and more details all the time as we get more sophisticated about this stuff.
Yeah.
What's the time frame for this to actually then become the standard?
Well, there's another important takeaway. So if everything goes on the schedule, if the thing doesn't blow up, which it still could, but if it goes through and gets approved, the council will have a meeting in August. They'll deal with any appeals through hearings where, again, issues are being brought up or amendments are being made to make further changes to the standard. They'll issue it in late August or maybe early September. We won't see that or know that for a couple of weeks later, because after that council meets, they won't post their decisions. It's kind of like a Supreme Court. They make their decision, you hear about it later. And the same thing's true here. So it would be effective, in that late August, early September timeframe. And that's important too. So when products are certified to a standard, they meet the standard at the time that they're certified. So right now, if someone's certifying something, there's a 2018 edition of 1971. They would get a label that says meets 1971-2018. But once they get to this, when this new standard goes in, there's a grace period. The grace period says manufacturers, you can continue to sell stuff that meets the old standard while you transition your product to meet the new standard. And that was another area of debate. There's argument between 12 months and 18 months. And we decided at this meeting, or we're deciding through an amendment process rather, that we would have 12 months for work uniforms and turnout gear and 18 months for SCBA and PASS devices. And there's a reason behind that. But this grace period allows manufacturers to sell stuff. Departments that would be getting product would still be meeting the old standard even during that grace period until that new product is certified and available from the manufacturer.
Okay, so that NFPA goes into effect, boom. But typically people get that adjustment period to go through it.
That's right.
One thing that I think you and I we talked about a little bit, and in the field we hear a lot about mandated particulate blocking structural hoods. Can we use that as an example? Where is that at right now in the NFPA standard?
So that's a great example. So in the current edition, 2018, we instituted a new category of hoods called particulate blocking hoods. These are hoods that have an extra layer in it that will keep particulate, soot, and particles from entering and depositing on the face. That was optional. It was optional at that time. Now, and that was partly to allow for this transition period because everyone's used to it. And there's some caveats that come with it. It may not be as breathable. There's some other things that may feel different to a firefighter. They may feel more encapsulated, for example. So at the beginning of this revision cycle, the committee made a decision that they wanted to make all hoods required to have this particular blocking capability. And as such, that means that if you liked your knit hood and it's fine for you, or you're an instructor and you wanted to have a really, really thick hood because you're repeatedly being exposed in a flash chamber or something like that, that hood may not pass with these requirements. So that was a bit of a contention. So it went through. In the current draft, it would be standard. If it was published today, you would have mandatory particulate blocking hoods. But one individual or company has brought up a criticism and said, no, we really think it still should be optional. They went back to their customers. They did polls and surveys, and had information in FDIC and other aspects to find out, is this what we really want to do right now? Should we still let the department make that choice, or should we make sure that everyone has that? And that's an amendment that's going to be handled in the same time frame that the standard's being approved, so that if it is approved, it will become optional again, and it'll converge in the new standard. If it isn't, the standard will move forward. So on top of all this stuff that happened last week, there are amendments that are going through to make other changes. The committee made some mistakes, or there's things they want to fix, or people want to reconsider things. Those amendments are plugging along at the same pace that the final standard is. They'll go in front of that standards council. They'll deliberate on all that stuff, and the result of it will be that issued standard in August. Again, unless everything blows up and they decide not to issue the standard for whatever reason.
Now, before we get into all the potential changes and the amendments, at this point, what could theoretically blow it up?
There's been a lot of debate about what's called restricted substances, and specifically PFAS. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we're trying to do in this edition of the standard is say I'll use these words lightly, PFAS free. There's a lot of departments that say, I don't want PFAS in my gear. I don't need another layer of exposure, by wearing stuff that, potentially could affect my health and safety. We're trying to standardize how people make that claim. Anyone can say, well, I don't think I put PFAS in there. Or so we have a test that says, okay, you measure it this way, you measure these things, and if you meet these criteria, then you can say that you have, this much PFAS in your gear. So we are standardizing that claim, because the department say, well, I want that PFAS-free clear. Well, how do they know that, right? We have to have a way to standardize that, and no one else is going to do that but NFPA. NFPA is not sure if they want to do that, and that's the issue here that could blow up this edition of the standard.
So it's just about how it's measured, and are the trace amounts considered PFAS free, right? Like, this is where the argument and the debate starts, correct?
It is. And what makes it difficult is it's a tough topic. I mean, not just for firefighter gear, all consumer products, and even environmentally, we're looking at limits that can be very, very low. And when you're able to measure that low, you may find some stuff. So even if you never added any PFAS into a material intentionally, it could enter in. Maybe the machinery is contaminated. Maybe the packaging was contaminated. The water that is washed may be contaminated. I mean, there's all these ways that the gear can have measurable PFAS. And yet, we're trying to say it's PFAS free. So it's, getting a handle on that, we thought was really important. And we had really good consensus in the committee and all the other interest areas for doing this. I just think NFPA is a little scared of it right now.
Yeah. Well, it's a hot topic. I know that's a nice pun, an odd pun to use in this particular podcast, but I think that's a step in the right direction, though. So at least for manufacturers, they know what their goal is then, correct, for it?
That's right. It's not left up to judgment anymore. It's like, you meet it or you don't. So you either make by the way, it's not required. If they choose to make that claim, then they have a way of doing it. It's not saying that everyone has to be PFAS free. We're just saying, if you're going to make that claim, you follow these rules, you can make that declaration. And I think that's the right thing to do. And I think the committee agreed with that as well. And that's why that's the direction that we've taken.
Yeah, that makes sense. Going back to the meeting for a second, I think you wrote in an article that will be published here shortly that there were, 14 motions, and most of them were dismissed. Can you talk a little bit about that process, just in terms of kind of the behind the scenes agreements that are happening, and maybe give a couple examples there?
Yeah. So that's a great topic, because, if you can take away the adversarial part of a interaction, I think are always further ahead. And so, in essence, these are motions that basically turn back things that the committee did. And the committee didn't want that to happen, and they were going to speak against it. And we had parties that wanted to get what they wanted as well. So what made this work really neat, I think, is we got ahead together in front of the meeting and said, okay, is there other ways we can address this? So we got together and we started talking about these topics a long time ago, and those motions were originally crafted back in the fall of 2023. So since then, we've worked on amendments to help fix, clarify, rectify issues that were problematic, and that helped a lot of individuals that originally submitted motions to consider withdrawing them. And then there were a couple other things. They said, okay, if we deal with it this way in the future through another amendment or something like that, will you withdraw your motion? And they agreed to that. So it was pretty neat to see that something could have lasted a couple of hours with debate on both sides, come down to about 15 minutes where things were withdrawn. Everyone was happy. The only motion that went forward had to do with some details on SCBA cleaning. And even that entity said, you know what, we're going to make the motion, get this on the record so we know that commitment's there. We argued against it and said, and the person that argued against it on the part of the committee said, we don't agree with this. However, we'll propose an amendment to fix this. And then the other party gets back up and says, you know what? We urge the association to vote against the motion we just made. So, I mean, it's like, okay, we're all done, right? And it's neat because, again, the standards process isn't supposed to be adversarial. It's supposed to be collectively working for the greater good of the firefighter. And I think that's what people need to remember also from this. I think a lot of people think that there's a bunch of manufacturers that sit in the back room and they're trading stuff back and forth. But we've got representation of real firefighters that are, they're not only knowledgeable in this, but also those that may not know as much, and other interested parties that are speaking on topics that help, the fire service get to that right area of compromise where we can have consensus to truly improve firefighter health and safety.
Yeah, you mentioned a great word there, compromise. And we had talked about this, and I just before we'll still dig into those some of the major changes, folks. So stay tuned for that. But I think it's a great time to bring up, the NFPA and versus kind of like the fire service. There seems to be this ebb and flow of, we're working together, we're not working together. When you look at, all the different things and changes mandated with apparatus, and now we're looking at PPE. You've worked with NFPA for many, many years. You've worked with the fire service for many, many years. Where are we at with that relationship, and where do we need to go?
Well, I think there's always struggles. I mean, organizations change over time. Their priorities change. There's motives for how well the organization works, and there has to be accessibility. NFPA, like any other standards development body, is accredited by American National Standards Institute, which means there's guiding principles for openness and transparency of the process. And we like to think that that's continuing. We think that the fire service standards, which are about a third of the overall standards that NFPA writes. So just to give you an idea, there's about 300 plus standards, or was at one time. 100 of those are related to professional qualifications or training or safety and health, fire apparatus, all these different topics where immense amount of activity and support. NFPA tried to rectify that by going to a consolidation process where they're starting to merge standards, just like we discussed with 1970. Sometimes it's worked real well, and sometimes it's been a problem, and I think it's exposing other issues. So I think we're all still trying to feel our way around. I think there's a lot of people want to make the NFPA process work. Fundamentally, it's a great process, but that doesn't mean that people get perturbed from different things that happen and don't see it maybe as representing their interests. So we got to make sure that sentiment can be improved upon, and I think both parties would like to do that.
Yeah, it is an ebb and flow. I mean, you hear it. I'm very fortunate to have a lot of people to interview that have interactions with NFPA and are very influential, and you kind of hear both sides of that going forward. But I think your point being is we have to remember what the essence of this is about. Is that's improving the health and safety of the fire service, of firefighters, and providing the best service. Then on top of that, and it seems though from a firefighter standpoint, sometimes it gets too technical, and it's
Well,
like
it is, and I'll tell you that can be rectified. We sell a standard, and there's some committees have done this. They'll have a handbook that goes with it. It's almost like like you talking about my book, PPE Made Easy, right? But I mean, it's basically trying to make that standard and put it in a format, or the information a format that someone can digest and apply.
A Cliff Notes version for the truck guy, right?
Yeah, that's right. The truck version of NFPA 1970. We'll do that next. But the fact is, we have to create. Standards are great only when they're applied and they're accepted, and they won't be applied unless they're accepted, and they won't be accepted unless they're understood.
Mm-hmm.
And we get too into the weeds of the details of some of these requirements and whatnot, and consequently it can be problematic for a regular say, what am I getting with this? What does this mean in terms of how I'm being protected? What are going to be the limitations of that? We definitely need to communicate that better. We have a standard that's a companion to 1970, or at least 1971, which is a care and cleaning standard, and that is a little bit better, because we spend the appendix explaining. We said, we're telling you to do this, and by the way, here's how you can do it. If you want to clean gear, the annex is probably as thick as the requirements, and that's a good thing. In fact, the annex should be thicker, or we should have a different book that's written in a totally different style, that's more easily read and understood and implemented.
I would love to see that, like with 1500 as well. And then if you could really get just a suggestion is, how do we afford it? That's the other part, right? Like for departments. And I think that's a whole nother a podcast episode. But, I do like the fact, like you said, the Cliff Notes versions, and I've read a couple of those, pictures are good. Big words are good, right? And, but you're saying NFPA understands that. And
I think they do. I think they do, because remember that NFPA is supposed to be a platform. So in the ideal world, NFPA provides the framework for how these standards are created. It's up to the members that participate to be innovative and say, you know what, there's a style book, and this is the way we've been doing it. Do we need to keep doing it that way? Not necessarily. Can we be better? Yes, we can. We can always be better. And I think that the more we kind of embrace that philosophy and think about all the bombardment of individuals having, especially in today's lives, that's a big difference 40 years ago, right? No cell phones, no email, nothing, right? And now everyone's bombarded, and they need their information in succinct and accurate doses so that they can reflect on it and apply it properly.
MSA protects you from head to toe with their core fire service products, including the revolutionary MSA G1 SCBA at the center of the connected firefighter platform, FireGrid software, lunar connected device, Kearns fire helmets, and Globe turnout gear and boots. Driven by its singular mission of safety, MSA Safety has been at the forefront of safety innovation since 1914, protecting first responders around the world. For more information, visit msafire.com. That's msafire.com. When you go in, we go in with you. Now let's get back to the show.
And this is great to hear. I think people need to hear that all right, organizations, NFPA, and you as an advisory committee member are saying these things, and which makes me kind of go, okay, this draws me in. So we talked about the structural, the particulate blocking structural hoods. I think a really good thing that so far we've come from the conversation that I've gotten was, now if a manufacturer wants to say it's PFAS free, they at least have a standard that they have to meet. Right. And then I think one that's really that's kind of come to the forefront also is how to ensure that turnouts maintain performance over an expected lifespan. And there's some changes with that, correct?
There is. So, as we've modernized materials, I mean, when I first was involved, there were thick, heavy materials. In fact, it's interesting. We used to measure insulation not using some sophisticated test, but how thick the clothing was. That's how things have changed. We got tests to do that now, right? To show how much heat and whether it's going to cause a burn injury or not. But you know, what we need to worry about now is that the materials are lighter. They're usually more flexible. You talk about athletic types gear and all this other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But there's trade-offs. Every time you say, okay, we're going to do this. Okay, well, we'll make it more insulative. Well, wait a minute. Now we're causing too much heat stress. We got to ratchet back from that. And now, you know, we got to have it durable. So if we wash it so many times and it's only good for 3 years, that's no good either, right? And then there's changes from the industry, like removing PFAS from gear that has changes. There's all these different things going on, and we have to find that optimum fit. And it's not simple because, okay, do you want more protection, more staying time, or do you want less heat stress? And we have to build in some of those minimum requirements, and that changes the durability of the gear. Unfortunately, some of those things, and consequently, that's one of the things that some of the fire service is seeing right now. They're seeing gear that may not last as long. They thought, hey, I used to get 5 years, now I'm getting 3, or I had gear for 7 years and now it's not holding up for more than 3. That's a problem because this stuff is expensive.
Yeah.
And if we're not addressing it one way or another, then I sometimes think, go to the grocery store. It used to be that, better yet, television. We had 3 channels, right? Now we have, unlimited channel. Sometimes it could be too many choices. And by having too many choices, you don't know how it all comes together. So the idea of the consolidation was kind of cool, is that what we might do is think of a system. You get your gloves, your garments, your helmet, your hood, all that stuff comes together. It's got to be, it only works if it collectively works. So if we can characterize those things and understand how they work as a system and develop our criteria accordingly, rather than looking at each little bit and piece and having too many different variables, then maybe that's a way to improve all that, make it cheaper, and also make it better understood in what its performance can be and what it isn't.
When you talk about particulates and obviously health has been a part of PPE now. I mean, they're combined together. We talked about the PFAS a little bit, but I think one of the things that also has been addressed is the ability to clean the clothing materials. And I think that goes hand in hand with the performance properties, because we're cleaning them now more thoroughly, but then the material has to be able to withstand that, correct? That's kind of where that gets
that's
to.
right. And so, and that, by the way, I've spent decades on that. So I first did the work on that in the 90s. No one was interested in it. That was the Marlboro Man era. And, it really didn't come to fruition until, about 20 years ago. And now, as you said, we're cleaning, the fire services got it. They're cleaning their gear after every fire most times, but there's a payoff. There's a consequence of that, which is the gear is wearing out. You think, oh, wait a minute, this stuff is built for structural fires, and yet if I put a little bit of bleach on it, I'm going to destroy it. That's literally the kinds of limitations they have for some of this technology, is that the cleaning is probably there. In fact, your regular consumer clothing breaks down the more often you wash it, and there's nothing different with turnout clothing doing the same thing. And so how we address that cleaning and make that effective, and then, is there different technologies there? There's this onset of carbon dioxide dry cleaning that may be a solution, and some other new novel technologies. And that may be a way that we balance some of that part of it out, but that all has to be addressed in terms of how effective it is, what's its impact on the gear, was it changing the service life, or we creating damage that may make the gear less protective. All those parts of the problem have to be equally addressed.
And those are addressed a little bit in this new.
We are. This addition to standard, we're moving in requirements to essentially demonstrate what the impact of that cleaning is, and just as equally how effective that cleaning is. So if someone introduces a new material, say this is great stuff since sliced bread, and they put it to the test and say, wait a minute, I'm only getting out 20% of the contaminants. That's not a good sign, right? So we want to make sure that that's another area of assessment, but we're just adding tests, so we got to be real careful how we balance all this out.
And that's for the manufacturers really to know and understand.
It is, right? But it's for them to also report to their customers. That's the whole point of this. If they're doing tests that are required for the standards, that's information that should be put in the firefighters' hands so they can make a decision whether that's relevant or not to them.
In summarizing, like a lot of these changes, do you think that's the biggest thing, is that we're just trying to not mandate, but we want manufacturers to then be more accountable to the consumer with knowledge, like you were just saying, so we could at least make a better informed decision? Is that kind of where majority of these changes come from?
Well, that's something I've been advocating, and a lot of fire service agrees with that. I mean, you just say it's got the certification label, it says it meets the standard. That may be good enough for some people, but it's not good enough for everybody. And again, when we're in a resource limited industry, right, with fire service sometimes scrambling funds, trying to say, do they build a new station? Do you bring in, can they staff adequately? All these things, right? We need that accountability needs to be there. And we need to also provide the information that allows us to interpret this information. Just say, what does a THL mean, or now an RET, right? How are they going to deal with that and make a judgment whether that's relevant to them or not? So, that incumbency in the NFPA process can really come to reflect addressing these needs if, the proper objectives established and the communities are going in that direction. And I think that's where they're going. I know that, we're a nuisance for all the work that's required in going in all these complicated standards, and the fire environment just grows increasingly more complex, and other issues are confronting us. But we have an opportunity, I think, to make some, rational decisions on improving these standards and making them accessible and understandable to everyone that needs to know and obviously values their health and safety.
Absolutely. So, Jeff, what are some of the other big changes ahead for 1970 that you're anticipating?
Well, I mean, other than the cleaning, the restricted substances, the particulate blocking hoods, we think that there's some opportunities for systems evaluation. So again, when you put all these things together, there's some areas that are more protected than others and so on. Trying to balance all that out is something that may happen with this new standard. It's an option right now where there's full assessments that either be done in a laboratory level or at the department level, where you can assess things ergonomically from a protection standpoint and otherwise. I think that's another big draw for what might be happening with this standard. We're also looking at the durability issue that we brought up. So we're trying to modernize, what our thinking is and look at a broader set of those trade-offs. And again, create information that departments can use. So, and I'm generalizing here, but there's so many little specific changes that I think would be difficult, obviously, to account for all those right now. And of course, some of the articles go through that in a little more detail.
What are you super excited about? I mean, you do have an enthusiasm for, making these positive changes. You can tell just by our conversations behind the scenes and now. I mean, what are you really excited about as the 1970s moving forward?
I think what we need to do is almost take a step backwards and reevaluate where we are. It's too easy to just take the status quo, keep adding to the status quo. We sometimes talk about like the SCBA being a Christmas tree, keep having more stuff on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we need to think more about integration and the ergonomic, the human factor fit to all this stuff, and address those things, and also deal with the resource part of it. Because it's one thing to continue to make things more complicated, test things more, but you really got to look at the value of everything that you do and see how it adds up and truly contributes to an improvement in health and safety. I think we can do that now. Consolidation could help that where it's done properly. And this might be the chance to finally do that. We're just kind of just getting into that right now. So maybe the next stage will be at a more sensible, affordable, and relevant set of requirements that the fire service can embrace.
Yeah. Almost more like the application side. You're kind of getting to a point where like, hey, we're where we need to be with a lot of the research and data collection. Now let's next phase is this is how we should apply it.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you very much.
Now,
So
I told you I'm a truck
process?
guy. Just dummy it down, man.
Yeah.
What is that process like? Once it passes, like how is the announcement made to the wider fire service about what changes are
Well,
coming and how to apply them?
Well, NFPA, it really is up to individual organizations and entities to do that. I mean, the NFPA will obviously say that there's things, and there's a preface in the standard that'll talk about what's new in the standard. But the reality is the manufacturers who have deep knowledge of their products and how they're changing, as well as some of the individuals that, that I work with as well, that are great in informing, whether it's the unions or the other groups that are just strictly promoting health and safety among the fire service. Though I think each of us play this part of providing, informing the fire service and what's changing. And you don't want to get everything from one source anyway, because that gives you different perspectives. And I think this is what it's unfortunately it's just there's no formal process by that all those announcements being made. So it's a collective of different interested parties that obviously have different motivations for that, but nonetheless still genuinely want to improve that knowledge within the fire service base.
How do you think firefighters overall are going to react? And do you think there's like one or two changes in particular that will be, I don't know, controversial? Or
Well, we got more than a couple. And we've had things like the 10-year service life, for which isn't part of 1970, but the use standard. But I think for the most part, the mainstream fire service appreciates that someone's looking out after their protection needs. I think that there are times when individuals are not satisfied for a variety of reasons because they've become accustomed to the way they operate. They're comfortable within the boundaries that they know their limitations exist, and they may see some of this stuff as overreaching. And I get that. It almost brings up the aspect, should we have kind of like tiers or levels, right, for people to decide? And we've had big arguments whether that's the right way to go, because you figure everyone's going to go to the common denominator and maybe give up stuff that they really should have. So that's a tough path to go down. But we're seeing some of that now. We're trying to introduce that in sensible ways, and so that there can be a way to accommodate. So this, for example, is argument about particulate blocking hoods. That is an example where a department say, if we manage this correctly, or we may not need them, or our fire call volume isn't as high that demands it, whatever that might be. They're responsible for doing their own hazard risk assessment, but they need to have the tools to be able to manage that and commensurately choose the clothing and equipment to meet in those particular risks and demands, or hazard demands.
Yeah.
How do you think the manufacturers are going to respond to the changes?
I think they see it as a matter of doing business. I mean, most of the manufacturers in this business are there truly because they believe in the fire service, and they genuinely want to, provide. They're proud of being able to provide equipment that can save firefighters' lives and allow them to do their jobs to save others' lives. And I think that speaks for the majority of the companies that are involved in this industry. And so they do what it needs to take, and they don't just meet the standard. They usually exceed the standard in different ways, that they promote their products differently or uniquely demonstrate some capabilities that they're proud of and have been able to validate. The standard allows them to do that. And I think that's something that they see as a plus most of the time.
Yeah. And the standard holds them accountable to that. And so,
It does.
Yeah. And swinging back as things keep progressing, as you're saying, manufacturers will gladly meet that. They'll keep meeting that. They're trying to stay ahead of that in some cases. I think there's always two sides to everything too. And I think, the fire service, we're really quick to try to point the finger, but we got to understand, right? Like all this stuff then comes back to us in higher costs in some cases. So, we had talked about that too, like NFPA and these committees. Does that come up at some point a lot of times as you're talking, like the cost? And
well, it does. I mean, it's not supposed to. I mean, you said, well, we're not going to provide the safety feature because it costs too much, right? That kind of doesn't go over very well, particularly what side, depending on what side you are. But, the idea is, but we have to take into consideration that, we're not going to create some requirement that is so onerous that is expensive, that makes clothing less affordable, maybe pushes organizations away from even complying with a standard. I mean, that's not the right solution either. So it's got to be pragmatic and practical and affordable at some level. And we have to keep that in mind. We don't talk about it in that way, but I think we act in that that direction often because we realize that, again, there's, if it's not the product is the standard isn't accepted because it's over the top, then that's an issue that doesn't serve anybody, the fire service or anyone else that's involved in the process.
Yeah. It's kind of just understood that if we set this up so much, nobody's going to apply it. So why even have a standard at that point, right? Like you have to meet the fire service.
We've had that happen before. We had some standards in other areas where I'll tell you what, we got a wildland respirator standard. No one built a product to it, right? Something's wrong there. Something needs to be fixed to make that standard workable because wildland firefighters need a respirator on occasion, particularly those in the urban interface areas. And, we got to get it right. And sometimes we don't get it right. So the market will tell you when you don't, because they won't buy the product. They won't, adhere to the standard.
Yeah. But it sounds like this is the great part about this is that you're listening. Committee members are saying something, NFPA is listening, and they're in essence trying to do the same thing we're doing. They're just trying to get better. They're trying to provide a better standard. They're trying to provide, better products within the fire service. And I think ultimately that's the cool part about, conversations like this, right? Like
last week, we were able to draw these compromises, get people not to be in an adversarial position. And this is not an adversarial. This is all for everyone's good. Not everyone's going to have the same idea what the ultimate solution is or the right, perspective on each issue according to each other. But, at the end of the day, I think we all should be there for improved firefighter health and safety. And, NFPA can provide that platform. And if that works well, then that's the best way to do it because it's a system that has worked and will continue to work, but more importantly, can get better.
This is a great conversation. I've learned a ton and I appreciate your insight and just your honesty with this whole thing. Cause it's great to at least hear someone who's on the committee say, yeah, it's tough sometimes to understand all the different things that are in motion with this. This goes back to one of my final questions for you here is, how can you, or what do you think, like what could be one of the biggest improvements that could be made in the process?
Well, I mean, in the process itself, any process to create a standard, standards language is complicated enough. And so the idea is there has to be conduits for getting the feedback, the real feedback from the, line firefighters to the committee. Now we have firefighters that have learned the committee language, the standards process, so on and so far, but they're only a small subset of a much larger population. So my desire in improvement is we have to find ways. They don't necessarily engage in the standards. They get bored out of the minds right away when they got into that type of forum. But what they can do is define their needs. We present them with options to say, okay, you go this way, that way. What do you think? That's the value. We definitely need the voice of the fire service. And we also need the other interest areas to say, well, yeah, that sounds great. We may not be able to do it like you want to, but there has to be that level of communication on a fundamental level to understand what the objectives are, what's possible in terms of capabilities, and what has to be recognized as being limitations. If we can achieve that, then we'll be a lot more successful.
Mm-hmm. And if somebody wants to communicate them or get more involved with it, what's the process for them?
Well, they can contact the NFPA. They can contact me. I help people even when I don't agree with the issue, because I think it's important for that voice to be heard. And, there's other members like myself on the committee that are willing to help. There's certain organizations that also represent various interests within the fire service. You go to a trusted source and you talk to them, and how can you help have my voice heard at the levels where I think it should to make some impact. There's not a list I can give you. I just think that people will learn who those individuals are and go to them.
Yeah.
I just want to note, we do have on Fire Rescue One, we have a page, firerescue1.com/NFPA standards series, where we're basically providing information all about these topics. Anything related to NFPA changes, you can look for updates there as things continue to evolve. And there are many of Jeff's great articles and the webinars there as well.
Well, thank you.
This is great. I have a ton more questions, but Janelle, of course, she tries to keep me honed in on some of these things. I
Hey,
unfortunately didn't
don't blame me.
follow.
I'm not trying to shut you down, you know.
Well, we have some other questions. We have, like to call them hot seat questions that we ask all of our guests. So you're going to be on the hot seat just for a couple of them. And again, thanks for all the insights on this PPE. And as the process goes back through, we look forward to continually reading your articles and hopefully have you back in. Because me being a truck guy, I've learned a heck of a lot, and hopefully our listeners have too.
Well, thank you, Aaron.
All right, Jeff. So first hot seat question: what do you see as the biggest challenge facing the fire service today?
I think that trying to figure out how to, making that transition from the structural role to the non-structural roles. It'd be nice that, you have your wardrobe that you go out with, right? But that's not practical. Or you're on a call that starts out as something that becomes something else, right? We've become reliant on turnout gear for everything. There's got to be a way to make that work. So that's a big challenge. Now there's, convertible gear and some other things that people have tried, just hasn't taken for a variety of reasons. So being able to have the right gear for the right hazards, I think, is still a big challenge within the fire service.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've been in for almost 4 years, as we talked about in the intro. What's the biggest, I guess I should say, what's the most positive change you've seen in the fire service over your career?
I think, well, obviously the acceptance of the newer gear coming from the standards, but the thing I think I'm most grateful for is the fire service recognizing that they have to have clean gear, that they have to take care of this stuff in order for them to take care of them and not create new hazards. So, the problem with contaminated gear is, you're wearing all the time. You're putting on children at a school demonstration. I mean, that's all changed now. I think I'm really pleased that the fire service has recognized that, it's a hazardous profession. The gear gets intensely contaminated. It's a problem, and now we're taking better care of it. So I'm definitely, I think that's been a huge success.
Yeah, like you had said earlier on, the gear has changed, but just our approach to take care of it. And I've been in for 20 years, and I can see that change. And for those that don't know what we're talking about, get on board with it, because the gear needs to be clean and it needs to be cared for. One more question that we have for you, and this is the coup de grace, about bringing everything back together. We talked about ways that the fire service could improve. We talked about ways that the NFPA could improve. What about you? What are you working on to improve? What are you working on to get better?
Well, too much. I wish I could dedicate myself to topics more. It seems like, split. I do a lot of work in the fire service. I also do work with other industries like healthcare and Department of Defense. And, I wish I could devote activity to one area, but I have to tell you that by being in all these different areas, you usually see things you can take away from one thing and pull into another area. Mm-hmm. So that synergism that does exist is helpful. I just wish I had more people I could work with, and there are out there, reach out and to help guide and make these improvements, because it takes a lot of effort, and obviously it draws down, but it's just wish I had more time. That's all I could say about that. I'm a workaholic already, but I don't think I can go much further with it.
Yeah, I think one way we all can get better is take other aspects of our life and apply it back into the fire service.
That's true.
And I think that's kind of what you're saying is, hey, you work with other industries, but we all have a lot of similar challenges. If you want to break down the basics of it, is, staying consistent on trying to improve. And I agree wholeheartedly. And that's really what we're about on the podcast here. It's about trying to improve, trying to get better, trying to be a little more knowledgeable about PPE in this case, about the NFPA. And Jeff, again, thanks so much for joining us. Again, we're going to have a lot of NFPA standard information. You can visit firerescue1.com/NFPA standards series for more resources about PPE changes ahead. You can also watch this podcast if you're just listening. We really want you to go to our YouTube channel. We would really like it if you rated and reviewed the show, shared it with some friends and family. You can email us if you have some questions for Jeff or Janelle or myself, or if you have some input about the show, you can email us at bettereveryshift@firerescue1.com. Again, if you are listening, thank you for listening, by the way. I should have said that right away. Thank you, Jeff, for your insight and for being with us today. Look, folks, it's all about trying to improve, trying to gain knowledge. It comes down to applying what you learn, trying to dedicate time every single day to just getting better. It's about learning something, doing something, and sharing something to make you and those around you better every shift. Thanks again for listening.